130 years have passed since the chilling events on the London streets of Whitechapel, where the famous serial killer Jack the Ripper lived out his inhuman fantasies. Some suggest that he was a famous surgeon at the time, others write that he was an artist, and still others believe that the Ripper may have been a member of the royal family. Each of his demonstrative murders was planned down to the smallest detail and executed with incredible brutality. Despite the fact that the grim streets of the East End were almost always filled with people, Jack never left any witnesses. Even after more than 100 years, his identity remains unsolved, making him the most mysterious killer in history. According to the official Whitechapel police, 5 women died at the hands of the Ripper in 1888. These murders are officially considered canonical, though in fact there were many more similar crimes. Their bodies were dumped in crowded streets, which confirms the theatricality of his actions. Jack always needed a reaction. His victims included 42-year-old Mary and Nichols, Polly, Annie Chapman. Her belongings were arranged around her body and threatening words about Jews were left on the wall nearby. Swedish Liz, nicknamed Long, and Katie Eddowes and Mary Kelly. All of them were prostitutes. The third and fourth victims were killed on the same night of September 30, 1888, their bodies found only 40 minutes apart. But only the latter had her internal organs removed. For the first time the killer was frightened away and did not have time to complete his terrible plot. According to some testimonies, the last person who saw Annie Chapman alive was Andrei Kadosh. According to him, the woman was then in contact with an unknown man with a small, twisted mustache, dressed in a dark suit and holding a briefcase in his hands. The police did everything possible in those days: searches with dogs, numerous investigations, night patrols, arrests, but they could not stop and expose the murderer. Scotland Yard was prepared to do anything not to lose its reputation, even the most desperate and ridiculous actions. So, for example, one night the police put a decoy on the street, a boxer dressed as a prostitute. But this only caused ridicule and mockery from reporters because the switch was too obvious to be true. The autopsy of the bodies revealed that the killer was most likely a practicing surgeon. The precision and speed of his actions, as well as his brilliant knowledge of anatomy, left no doubt about it. Each time the Ripper unmistakably removed the organs he wanted from women without affecting the rest. In addition, the medics who autopsied the bodies of the victims determined that the killer was left-handed. But then why were the women's throats cut from left to right and not vice versa? Because he did it from the back. What if Jack the Ripper is more than one person? Then it becomes clear why his identity was never established, and why the testimony of potential witnesses was so vague. After all, they could have simply been describing different people. There were countless versions, one more monstrous than the next. And there was reason to believe every one of them. The newspapers pressed the situation. The headlines literally screamed, "Whitechapel murders." Panic erupted in London. People fled the East End, tried to stay off the streets after dark, and introduced civilian patrols, but all in vain. Prostitutes could not be isolated from the threat anyway, since nightly outings were still their livelihood. The killings continued. The police were bombarded with letters from the killer, many of which, however, were simply written by journalists in order to sensationalize the story once again. It was they who signed their messages, Jack the Ripper, which soon became a household name. Other letters, as it turned out, were sent by mentally ill people posing as murderers. And only 3 of the letters belonged to Jack, the real Jack. The last of these, which went down in history, was the famous letter from hell. In this letter the murderer wrote, "I roasted and ate a kidney. It was beautiful. Catch me." The medical examination confirmed that the kidney attached to the letter did indeed belong to the 4th victim, Katie. Nevertheless, somehow this letter was lost, while the others are still kept in the archives of Scotland Yard in a file of unsolved cases. The murderer was presumptuous and played to the public, knowing that everything would be printed in the pages of the newspapers. The investigation was at a standstill. All of the murders were committed on a Friday or weekend, which led investigators to believe that the killer was most likely a working man. But by whom, exactly? The last murder, committed on November 9, 1888, was the climax of the series. The victim was found in her home, in bed, but she was unrecognizable. Her body was completely disemboweled, there was blood everywhere, and her face was disfigured. Her internal organs were neatly arranged around the bed, and only one, the main one, was never found. The killer had taken her heart. Mary Kelly was the first person not to be killed in the street, and the villain had plenty of time to fully enjoy his gruesome ritual and to realize his sick fantasies to the last drop. That was the end of the murders as abruptly as they began. In the morning the incident was reported to Queen Victoria, to which she replied,
"Our courts should be burned down and our detectives replaced by others. We need police officers to be men, and they are not."
These were the first sexually motivated serial murders. The people were not prepared for this, and the metropolis was consumed by terror. Neither then nor now can anyone understand what it was: black magic, mutilation of the dead, Masonic ritual murder, sacrifice, or revenge.